wish. Yeah, thanks very much. It's basically results of I'm going to be presenting today on results of a wetland integrity assessment we've been doing on wattle crane breeding sites. So the wetlands we've selected have basically been on whether or not the wetlands are currently used by wattle cranes for breeding or historically used by wattle cranes for breeding. So I feel a bit... start a presentation. Hey? Oh.
Just navigate.
Navigate through there. Okay, sorry. I was looking at the computer. Okay, so quick presentation outline. I'm obviously going to introduce wattle cranes to you guys. I feel a bit outnumbered today. In this room, everyone's talking about ecosystems and ecological integrity. I'm actually going to mention a species by name today, wattle cranes, but it's a species that's really dependent on a specific ecosystem and ecological processes that drive those ecosystems. So it's very much relevant, and I'll teach you guys a thing or two, hopefully, about wattle cranes. And it's majority KZN in here, so we're talking about our provincial bird. Okay, so basically I'm going to just run through what we know so far about wattle cranes in terms of what determines their breeding. Understanding what we mean by wetland health or wetland integrity. What is wet health, which is the tool that we used. Most of you guys should know about it. Summary of the results, how we've tweaked wet health to make it a bit more applicable to wattle crane breeding, management interventions that have been identified, and a way forward. Which one? Spacebar.
Yeah, just give it some time to
really slow. Is it cold?
It's frozen.
What's going on? Sorry, guys.
Okay.
Ish.
Yeah.
It knows all the information that's about to come.
Yeah.
That's why.
I'm just gonna get somebody now.
Okay. I'll give some time for
Sorry.
to settle. No, it's fine. Can I not just push Control Alt? Of course, I've got pretty pictures. I have to have them. I know. Which one is it? Lecture 3.
Lecture 3.
Yeah, it looks like it's got 2 right there. It's very long.
Of course.
Maybe the photos are too big. Magic man. Okay, so this is wattle cranes for dummies. In 4 words, I'm going to describe wattle cranes. First one, it's rare. There are fewer than 260 wattle cranes left in South Africa. It's approximately 85 breeding pairs located in the eastern part of our country. And 85% of the country's population is located right here in KwaZulu-Natal, with the stronghold really being around the KZN Midlands, so from here through to Central Berg, and then a smaller population of birds down in southern KZN. So that's so slightly outdated SABAP 2 map distribution, but basically the red there is highlighting areas that were previously recorded in SABAP 1 that haven't been recorded in SABAP 2. So the distribution is really focused around the orange, green and blue areas in South Africa. They're old. Sorry, Pete. Adults live for between 30 and 40 years. Obviously in human terms that's not old, that's mature. But I would never call you guys old. I'm not 30 yet, so I can. But yeah, they're very long-lived species. So they're really slow breeders, but they rely on as the biology of a population to persist for a long period. and cranes in general are amongst, if not the oldest family of birds in the world. So they're really old. And they're really big. So adults are more than 5 feet tall. For reference, I am 5'2". Look at an adult in their eyes. And they weigh approximately 8 or 9 kgs. Unfortunately, there it is where our similarity ends. I wish we had 8 kgs. And wow, it's a bird. So basically, to summarize, they're really old, big birds. So they are covered in feathers, which makes them a bird, obviously. But basically, this bird loves wet feet, and that's what really makes it a really special bird to work with in terms of trying to conserve, to use it as a flagship species to conserve a specific ecosystem. And in this case, they are dependent on large, permanent, high-altitude palustrine wetlands for breeding and foraging. Almost exclusively are the odd trash pairs that like not very nice habitat, but generally speaking, this is the sort of typical habitat that wattle cranes will utilize for breeding. That's up in Dartmoor, top of Karkloof. This is a view of Umgani Flay, a closer look at sort of the open water that they're reliant on for building nest platforms. And then that's a system just north of Franklin Flay on a farm called Wetland, which has got a breeding pair of wattle cranes. And the arrows indicating once again the open water that the birds select for building nest platforms. So obviously we've been doing quite a bit of work on wattle cranes for the last 20 odd years. We, it's the Royal We, it's KZN Wildlife, the KZN Crane Foundation, EWT, so a whole host of organisations have been doing a lot of work. And basically the focus in the past has really been around understanding how surrounding land use and level of fragmentation affects the continued breeding of wattle cranes. So the work has really looked at active and historic sites. We've got a really good understanding and database of active versus historic sites of wattle cranes. And a lot of the research, just pulling out some information, is that active sites tend to have more than 80% grassland within their core home range. There's a whole host of other stuff that came out, but I could do a whole nother presentation on this. And also water depth and soil penetrability have come out as really important environmental determinants between active and historic sites. And that active sites basically tend to be wetter, have more water. So now we're basically wanting to take a closer look at the wetlands themselves and link that understanding of the surrounding land use with the wetlands and how that impacts on a wetland's integrity or functioning. So we need to look at basically a wetland health, inverted commas. It's obviously not a true scientific term for wetland, but it's basically wetland health is a measure of deviation from, or measure of deviation of structure and function of a wetland from a wetland's natural reference condition. And we use 3 wetland characteristics to determine a wetland's health or level of integrity or present ecological state. And it's wetlands hydrology characteristics, its geomorphology characteristics, and the vegetation structure of that wetland. And we look at both basically the impacts within the wetland and its catchment as a whole to determine that level of deviation from the natural state. That makes sense. So basically, South African wetland ecologists has been really leading in developing a tool called Wet Health, which is basically a tool that enables one to assess, determine and monitor a wetland's present ecological state. So an individual wetland or a complex of wetlands within an area. And this tool is really useful for a range of contexts, including wetland rehabilitation, wetland management, state of environment reporting and planning. But for us, it's been particularly useful in terms of meeting a need to identify trends and potential threats within wetlands that are used by wattle cranes for breeding, and as well as identifying management interventions that are required to either ensure that continued breeding or to create new sites for new breeding. And it's basically gives us a framework in which to greater understand the systems that wattle cranes are dependent on, and a greater understanding of these wetlands of specific characteristics and within the range of wattle cranes. So basically we've implemented Wet Health. For those of you who haven't used it, has 2 levels of use. So it's a level 1, which is a lot more basic. Generally speaking, it's a desktop study. And level 2 is desktop with a lot of field work. So we're using the level 1 framework, but we have done extensive field work in conjunction with the desktop work. So as Vaughan likes to call it, a level 1.5 wet health. We've completed the assessments for 12 sites in KZN, 7 active wattle crane nest sites, and 5 historic wattle crane sites. And we initially made no changes to wet health. We basically implemented wet health as you would learn to use it within a training workshop, or basically it was to get my levels of skills up in using wet health, so that we could then brainstorm around how we can sort of manipulate or change wet health that will make it more of a wattle crane perspective. But the last 4 sites we've done, we've started now changing and adapting wet health to make it more specific or more useful in terms of wattle crane management. Sorry. So these are examples of some of the maps that we produce before we go out into the field. So you have to produce extensive maps before that leads basically your field work on the ground. So we map the catchment of the wetland boundary, any sort of impacts within the wetland, so drains or cultivation, and then land use or catchment issues we map as well. So that's an example out in Klatikulu. This is an active site. That's also an active site near Underberg. And the dots are indicating the wattle crane breeding sites. Then this is a historic site out near Nottingham Road. So even before you even get into the field, this process really gives you a good understanding of the impacts within the catchment before you even get into the ground, to determine the impacts on the wetlands. And then that's a site near Underberg, down in Dublin, also a historic site. So basically, when you go into the field, you use the maps to obviously have a look at what you've mapped, and you go through and you map out aspects of impact within the wetland or within the catchment. It's about lots of note taking, lots of photographs, GPS points, all the rest of it. And in the end, is you come back into your office and you run through the framework, the Excel workbook of wet health. And the idea is that then you end up with ranking your wetland on basically a scale of 0 to 10, which is determined by that table that you see on the bottom there, with a combined impact score of 0 to just under 1 being completely unmodified wetland and natural, right down to between 8 and 10 being a critical modification, that basically the wetland's probably a car park. No longer existing. So these are the results that we got for the 12 sites that we've done so far, with the top 7 being the active sites and the bottom the historic. And we also, in conjunction with obviously trying to look at the scores, we try to look at the sediment component around the nest sites, because the theory is that wattle cranes are linked closely to your sort of peat, because they're in permanent wetlands. You would think that those systems would be peat dominated. And a lot of the active sites they were, but what we also determined our own term was organoclastic. So it was clastic in that it was clay or sediment, but with a really, really high organic content, indicating that they are associated with permanently wet wetlands. So this process, even though you get an overall score at the end, which basically combines the scores of the wetland on its hydrology, its geomorphology, and vegetation, it allows you to identify certain aspects of a wetland that you should be concerned about. So for our case, with the active sites, we obviously want to maintain those sites. Okay. And so for the active sites there, where you've got a down arrow, there's a trajectory of change that we anticipate that there's going to be a negative change over the next 5-year period. So in the top case, it was alien vegetation coming into the system. And for Riverlea, there was a major head cut that had formed in the wetland, so we've got a negative trajectory of change. So on that site, Rock Farm, we've put a positive trajectory of change because of the significant rehabilitation work that we've started on that site. And then those are historic sites where you can see that the hydrology, even though most of those sites came out as a C, which is moderately modified, it's not a lot of our wetlands in the province and the country are Cs. You can see the hydrology of those historic sites are really, really highly modified between Ds, Es, and nearly Fs, and that the hydrology is behaving completely unnaturally almost non-existent in those cases. So we quickly, I've got a few minutes left. We've started making some changes to wet health in that we've now started mapping impact classes within the wetland. So instead of just giving the wetland a score of C, we've gone into the actual wetland and mapped where the wetland's hydrology or vegetation has changed or is unmodified, was behaving similarly. So this is the map of a site out on the Theyre Road, Rock Farm, where you can see that the hydrology impacts have been mapped within the wetland itself, and the dark orange are basically the area of the wetland that have been highly modified in terms of its hydrology. A lot of draining, very, very dry. And then you can see where the dot is, where the wattle crane nest is, and where the birds utilise most of the wetland is completely unmodified or natural in terms of hydrology. And then that's mapping the vegetation, so similar to the hydrology, but not exactly the same. So that's just mapping where you've basically got similar vegetation attributes within the wetland. And that line, so if I go back quickly, if you see this line here, between the green and the orange, that's the photograph of the actual wetland. So you can see there's a very active, significant cut-off drain that is very effective at cutting off the hydrology lower down the wetland. And you pick that up not only in the vegetation, but as well as the hydrology of the wetland. So wet health really allows you to pick this up. So with doing this, we've a wetland rehabilitation team that's been funded by Lottery has just finished rehab work on a lot of those cut-off drains and a major head cut. So this is a structure that went into a head cut and has neutralised the head cut. Other aspects that is more specific to wattle cranes, so obviously the rehab work is addressing the wetland functioning. Obviously it's threatening a wattle crane nest site, so it's in our interest, but it's also reinstituting the functioning of that wetland. But some of the management interventions have been specific to the birds themselves, and that photo is a site in Underberg that through using wet health we identified Glyceria maxima, which is an alien invasive plant that grows in and covers open water within the wetlands. So we actually got a school group down in Underberg to come and assist with clearing an area of Glyceria to open up that water within the wetland to hopefully recreate suitable nesting habitat. And also using the tool that's a farmer in the photograph, that basically the cattle were crossing the wetland. It's a natural levee between a wetland that the birds utilise and the Mzimkhulu River. And with the cattle consistently crossing there, has now created where that wetland is broken through that natural levee which was creating the wetland. And now the wetland is decanting directly into the Mzimkhulu. So we're going to use some soft methods here, just drop some trees across there. And so using the tool really just assists. So basically we're going to do this for at least 25 more sites. So lots of work. And at least 5 of the sites we're going to use a level 2 wetland health assessment. And from there we really want to develop a sort of a habitat suitability assessment tool that we can look at assessing wetlands and their catchments for determining suitability for wattle crane breeding and usage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Because of the time limit, the first hand to be up will be the only speaker. The first hand to be up will be the only one. There is it.
Thanks, Ian.
Devil's advocate. Is it possible that wattle cranes only care about undisturbed areas with open water and they don't care about wet health?